Hey guys, so this video is going to be about SSH tunneling, also known as port forwarding. So SSH port forwarding is a mechanism in the Open SSH implementation for tunneling application ports from the client machine to the server machine, or vice versa. So local port forwarding allows you to forward traffic on a port of your local computer to the SSH server, which can then be forwarded to a remote server. So in this case, we're going to use a Raspberry Pi as our remote machine. So for example, say you want to connect to a Flask application running at port 5000 on your Raspberry Pi. The port for the Flask server is firewalled to protect it from external attackers. And although you can't directly access the Flask application from your local machine, you can through SSH. So let's start off by connecting to a Raspberry Pi. So let's SSH into our Pi. And here you'll see a little Flask app. But let's just run our Flask application here. So you can see that this Flask app is running on port 5000 on the Pi. And this app exposes a REST API to control the GPIO pins of the Raspberry Pi which it's running on. So I'll put a link in the description to the playlist that covers the building of this app if you want to check it out. So if we want to run a GET request to return all the active pins on this app, we can log into our Pi and then send a GET request to port 5000. So there you can see it sent a GET request to our server, and it returned all the active pins on our Raspberry Pi. So if we try to access the Raspberry Pi directly from our local machine here, this is the IP address of the Raspberry Pi, we're going to get a connection refused, and that's because Flask by default will not allow any outside connections. So in order to access this from our local machine, let's forward a port. So let's quickly go over these flags here. So we're calling SSH, and then the N flag, this means do not execute a remote command. So this is what we want for just forwarding ports. F, request SSH to go to the background just before the command execution, which is what we want. Since we don't actually want a remote terminal in our shell, this is useful if SSH is just going to ask for passwords or passphrase or whatever. So this prevents reading from standard in as well. And finally, the L flag. This is the local port forward option. This specifies that the given port on the local machine is to be forwarded to the given host and port on the remote side. So this works by allocating a socket to listen to the port on the local side. And whenever a connection is made to this port, the connection is forwarded over the secure channel and a connection is made to the host port from the remote machine. It's important to note that only the super user can forward privileged ports, so that's any port under 1024. So this command is saying, let's forward the port 9999 on our local host. So we want to use the local host interface. If you put an asterisk here, this will open to all interfaces. And we want to forward any connection from that port over to the local host interface on our Raspberry Pi's port 8000. And then here's where you put the IP of your device. So in this case, it's Pi, which I have in my SSH config. Oh, I just realized that this should be port 5000 since our Flask app is running on port 5000 on a Raspberry Pi. So let's run this command. Now if we run this request again, but this time on port 999 since that's the port we forwarded, and we're going to request our pins here, we should get a response from our Raspberry Pi which is running the Flask app. Alright, so there it is, and you can see it's made a GET request to our Flask server. So that's pretty cool. It's like we're just making an HTTP request to our local machine, but behind the scenes, OpenSSH is forwarding that request to our Raspberry Pi. So that's pretty cool. It saves us from having to SSH into our Raspberry Pi just to make this GET request. But where it really shines is when we need to do something graphical on the Pi. So suppose, like in this example, you're developing on a headless remote machine. So that's a server without a desktop, just like in this case of the Raspberry Pi. But you want to access an application with graphical interfaces listening on a certain port. So maybe, for example, we use our browser. So this Flask app uses Swagger UI to generate an interactive documentation website so we can interact with the API through the browser. So Swagger is pretty cool. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out. And so even though our Pi has no graphical capabilities itself, we can use our own browser on our local machine with SSH port forwarding to hit the Swagger UI site and interact with it through our browser. So let's open our browser here and let's hit localhost port 999 on our machine. And boom, there we go. So we're hitting the Swagger UI, which is hosted on our Raspberry Pi. So it's nice to get all this graphical capability. So this app is running on a Raspberry Pi, but we're using port forwarding to be able to access it from our own browser. So let's just make a GET request here. And you can see it's made a GET request onto our Raspberry Pi Flask app. So this is great. Raspberry Pi has no graphical capabilities itself. So if we want to do any sort of browser debugging or anything like that, we can just simply forward a port to our Raspberry Pi, or in this case the Flask app running on a Raspberry Pi, and use our own browser to do any sort of web development on it. So right now we have an open tunnel. So if we want to close the tunnel, we can simply look for the program that's running this, the SSH process. And here it is. So let's just kill that process. There we go. So now if we run this, we should get no response. Alright, so I hope that gave you an idea of how to get started with SSH port forwarding and gave you an idea of why this would be useful. So make sure to subscribe if you want more videos like this, and if you're interested in building a REST API or any of that sort of stuff to interact with a Raspberry Pi, I'm going to put a link to this playlist in the description. Alright, thanks for watching, guys.